Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
That's a tricky moment in British nuclear history, actually, because it's not so far away from the kinds of threats that in the last few years we've been saying, actually, Putin, you can't make that kind of threat.
It raised some interesting questions about how sovereign the UK programme really is and what might happen to it if the US is more isolationist.
The Labour Party had significant anti-nuclear elements, and the government in the 1970s didn't really want to talk openly.
In this episode, we explore the United Kingdom's nuclear weapons program, from its origins during World War II to its strategic choices during the Cold War. We examine how the UK's nuclear capabilities evolved and the challenges posed by forced modernization. We'll tackle the special relationship between the UK and the US, and the resulting debates around sovereignty and dependence. Our experts, Dr Marion Messmer, Dr Daniel Salisbury, and Sebastian Brixey-Williams will also shed light on arms control, non-proliferation, and the British commitment to disarmament.
My name is Daniel Salisbury. I'm a visiting research fellow at King's College London and an associate fellow at WWII. I've been studying nuclear issues now for about 15 years, mostly in different think tanks and research institutions in London and the UK. The UK's history with nuclear weapons really starts before World War II, but especially with the wartime program. So the UK scientists, some of them were involved in the Manhattan Project. After the war, a decision was taken in 1947 to pursue an independent nuclear capability. The program progressed pretty quickly with a successful test in 1952 of just regular nuclear weapons. And then in 1954, a hydrogen bomb decision was taken, which resulted in a successful test in 1957. In the early days of the program, you had a kind of a decision taken on the security rationale. It was the early days of the Cold War. The UK had this great power kind of mentality. There was almost a sense that why wouldn't it pursue nuclear weapons?
I'm Sebastian Brixey-Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the British American Security Information Council, or BASIC, in London. This year I'm also a research fellow at the Managing the Atom Project in the Harvard Kennedy School. Most of my work is focused around the rules and the norms around nuclear weapons, whether that's more on the non-binding normative side or on the legal side, looking at how international law is evolving. Independence has always been a sort of fascinating issue for the British nuclear program. Arguably, the reason the UK started a nuclear program at all is because it was concerned about the loss of its great power status with the decline of its colonial empire. There's a story that goes that Bevin demanded a British nuclear weapon with a bloody great Union Jack on top. And so efforts were made in the 40s and the 50s, particularly to make sure that the UK could stand alone from the US, which it had originally been cooperating with alongside a couple of other countries in the Manhattan Project. And it was frozen out of that project in 1946 by the McMahon Act, which essentially transferred control in the US from the military side to the civilian side and shut out allies from participating in that program. The UK had to go it alone at that point. This changed around the late 1950s. We had the Mutual Defense Agreement in 1958, which is a significant agreement of cooperation between the US and the UK, and that had followed an amendment to the McMahon Act that then allowed certain levels of cooperation between those two countries again. The Mutual Defense Agreement, or MDA, allowed for the exchange of nuclear materials, technology, information, such as test data, from the US to the UK and vice versa. Britain sent America a whole load of plutonium. America sent Britain uranium and tritium. There was a sort of two-way exchange that was then enabled. And that agreement, which has been renewed every 10 years since, and was in 2024 indefinitely extended, has provided the basis for a much deeper level of cooperation between the US and the United Kingdom over the years that followed. Towards the end of the 1950s, the UK was making decisions to try to adopt what was called the Skybolt system, which was an air-launched ballistic missile system that was being developed by the US, but with UK participation. And suddenly in the early 1960s, the US actually cancels this program. That's partly because the Skybolt had continuously been failing its tests and various components really didn't look like they were working, and partly because the US had successfully tested submarine-launched ballistic missiles for the first time. And so the need to have the aerial-launched version was obviated. The UK, which had planned its whole deterrent around the Skybolt, suddenly didn't know what it was doing. It led to an agreement between Kennedy and Macmillan in Nassau in the Bahamas in December 1962, which then led on to what was called the Polaris Sales Agreement the following year, which essentially allowed the US to share its submarine launch capability with British warheads on top. From that point onwards, really, the two systems were completely inseparable. The UK today talks about its weapons as being operationally independent, but from an industrial perspective, very much still dependent on the US government. And when Polaris was retired in the 1990s and the Trident system was introduced on the Vanguard submarines, which it's essentially on the same model, with the missiles coming from a common stock in America being fitted with British warheads and updated design, and looking, to all intents and purposes, quite similar to the American system.
I'm Marion Messmer. I'm a senior research fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House. In my work at Chatham House, I look at nuclear arms control. We essentially do a lot of work around rising nuclear risks and what states could do to reduce them. We've had a long investigation over the last few years looking at complexities in nuclear decision-making. And as part of that, we also developed a browser game, which is fun to play, but also hopefully teaches the players a few things about arms control. The other part of the relationship between the UK and the US and some of the ways in which the UK nuclear program relies on aspects of the US nuclear program is around how the UK is able to build its new warhead and how the UK has been able to ensure its delivery systems. At the moment, the UK uses a Trident missile in order to deliver its nuclear warheads, and that Trident missile is essentially purchased from the US. That's not the first time that the UK has purchased missiles from the US for that purpose. The previous missiles that the UK used, the Polaris missiles, were also purchased from the US. So again, this is an agreement that essentially goes back to the 60s, and that has been really long-standing between those two countries. And it helps the UK be able to have access to missile technology that it would probably have some difficulties producing domestically, just because of the state of the UK defence industry. The other interesting bit, I thought, was that the UK is also planning on purchasing the aeroshell, so part of the casing for the US W-93 warhead, to use it in the UK's new warhead program. The warhead itself remains a sovereign capability. The UK has always developed and built its own sovereign warheads, and it's continuing to do that. And it actually has invested in that capability and expanded that capability recently. But even there, the supply chains are very linked. In whatever cost-benefit analysis they did, they essentially decided that it was going to be cheaper and more cost-effective and more efficient for them to purchase the aeroshell for that warhead from the US rather than trying to produce it themselves. While that can make a lot of sense, and while the US and UK relationship is probably as safe and stable as any bilateral relationship between two states can be, it's interesting that you would base such an important part of your warhead development, your warhead program, and the supply chain that you might need to tap into for years to come if you need to build additional warheads, that you would tie that up so closely with another country. Essentially, the supply chain for this warhead is going to be very interlinked, if only because of the parts in this. The UK is obviously very proud of the fact that it has a sovereign capability for building its warheads. I don't think the UK nuclear program would be feasible without that. But at the same time, there is a lot of very close collaboration between UK and US national laboratories and so on. And I think it's interesting to think about whether the UK would be able to be truly independent. It would certainly be a lot more costly for the UK to reproduce all the elements for which it's currently relying on the US. It raised some interesting questions about how sovereign the UK program really is and what might happen to it if the US is more isolationist. It's not a new challenge. That's a challenge that the UK program has faced over the decades. And, there have been previous prime ministers that were very concerned about whether the collaboration could continue as it is. But given that the previous Trump administration was much more isolationist at times, there is a possibility that the UK might need to contend with questions of that sort over the next 4 years as well.
The British government has not always been open about the details of its nuclear weapons arsenal. Daniel Salisbury explains the history, and Sebastian Brixey-Williams elaborates on why that opaqueness makes it difficult to know what precisely the UK's deterrent is trying to achieve.
Until the late 1990s, there was very little information in the public domain about British nuclear weapons. In the 1980s, with the Trident decision, some more little bits of information about the platform and the types of systems and the numbers of warheads that the platform could carry were put into the public domain. But it was only really in the late 1990s that the UK started talking about the size of its arsenal. In the 1970s, the UK was pursuing a system described as a Cheveline, which was basically putting a UK unique front end on US Polaris missiles. The system was designed to increase the chances that the UK would be able to hit targets in Moscow, given their developments in the ABM system. And this program was very secretive. There were very few mentions to it in the public domain. Incidentally, it was a very expensive program and had a lot of cost overruns and that kind of thing. But this was really proceeds of Labour Party politics in a way. The Labour Party had significant anti-nuclear elements, and the government in the 1970s didn't really want to talk about it openly because then they would have to deal with a debate. And then in the 1980s, with the Thatcher government coming into power, the Trident purchasing agreement and also the basing of ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe, including the UK, there was quite a big and substantial nuclear debate. Thatcher really had an interest and was able to try and make the case publicly for British nuclear weapons. And this period during the early 1980s was really when we started to learn a little bit more about Britain's nuclear arsenal. And it was a process that kind of continued in the 1990s in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the Labour government started to publish things like figures on the size of the arsenal, that kind of thing.
What are British nuclear weapons for? I mean, famously, they were for what was called the Moscow Criterion. This is the destruction of Moscow, if nothing else, and ensuring that Britain had enough delivery systems to penetrate ballistic missile defense systems around Moscow and presumably destroy its not just the city and the people who live there, but also the military command structure, the general staff complex under the city, and so on. Whether this holds today, we don't know. We don't have a lot of information really about whether the Moscow Criterion has ever been abandoned. But if you look at the makeup of the British arsenal, it implies that it's probably the case. We continue to have submarine-launched ballistic missiles. These are typically framed as a second strike system. They're more useful for that than as a first strike system. And they will have what's generally seems to be acknowledged, although again this isn't a public figure, something between the 80 to 100 kiloton yield on the missiles. So these are fairly large yield weapons and the sort of thing that you would be using if you were trying to destroy a large military bunker under a city, for example. So let's assume that that's the sort of primary purpose as a second strike weapon. It's there in the back pocket to say, don't cross a certain line, or that'll be that. The other question is whether the UK has any interest in lower yield weapons use. And in the 2006 Defence Review, there was a statement that sort of asserted that the UK has a lower yield version of the same warhead, which is probably one that uses the primary explosive but not the secondary. Since then, that type has not really been talked about again in public documents, but one can assume that's probably still around. And so there's an interesting question of why have a low yield weapon? What's that for? The UK actually doesn't make a great number of nuclear threats, I'm glad to say. We don't have a huge amount of data to draw on. One moment where it did make a nuclear threat, or actually three, was in the period around the Iraq War. So in 2002, Jeff Hoon made three sort of fairly explicit nuclear threats that implied that nuclear weapons would be on the table if needed in relation to Iraq. That's a tricky moment in British nuclear history, actually, because it's not so far away from the kinds of threats that in the last few years we've been saying, actually, Putin, you can't make that kind of threat in relation to Ukraine. This is a non-nuclear weapon state. This is a state that doesn't have the capacity to defend itself in the same way at all. And the UK has issued negative security assurances, albeit with some caveats that say essentially we don't do that. Iraq was complicated. The conversation about WMD was not straightforward. But nevertheless, this is not the kind of nuclear threat or use that I think is typically imagined in the UK government, and certainly not today. It's hard to imagine. But I still think there's a question about, is it possible that the UK government is thinking about the use of lower yield weapons for escalation management in some way? The United Kingdom was the third state to successfully test a nuclear weapon. It did that in 1952 with Operation Hurricane out in the Montebello Islands in Australia. It did that inside one of its warships, HMS Plym, in the hope that this would give it some data about how it could protect UK naval sites. And then in 1958, it conducted its first hydrogen bomb tests. These are sort of famously known as Operation Grapple. It conducted 4 tests in Malden Island and Kiritimati, which is often known as Christmas Island in today's Kiribati. In general, conducted far fewer tests than most of the other nuclear armed states today. If you consider the US tested over 1,000 times, the UK tested only 45, actually the same number as China in its history as well. And it tried to keep to quality over quantity. Tests are expensive, and it aimed to test smart rather than hard. The UK, along with the US and the Soviet Union, signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, or LTBT, on the 5th of August in 1963. It came into force later that year. This prevented the UK from testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, under the ocean surface. This is to say the UK had already done a series of major tests in this space, so it was entirely relevant that they were doing this. And it also came at a time where the UK and the US were starting to think about cooperation in their testing going forwards. And so the need to conduct further above-ground tests when the option for underground nuclear testing was becoming more available did somewhat obviate the need to be doing that. And then in the 1990s, the UK followed that up by signing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, and this was one of a series of treaties in the mid-1990s where, at a time where there was quite a lot of hope in post-Cold War in constraining the development of nuclear weapons arsenals globally, the CTBT is designed to, as the name implies, ban tests more comprehensively, so not just up in the atmosphere or in outer space, but all over the world, underground, above ground, whatever it is. Unfortunately, the CTBT has never come into force, so there's a requirement that a certain number of states, including several with nuclear weapons, become parties to the treaty, and they haven't, so it's something of a cooperation problem.
Marion Messmer talks to us about the role the UK is playing as one of the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the Non-Proliferation Treaty in their engagement with one another to support the treaty.
The UK has been a really active member of the P5 process. I think it last shared in 2019, and it's about to take over the chairmanship again. It's quite interesting to look at the pre- and post-COVID chairmanship because so much has changed in Europe and globally in that time period. We can probably expect the UK to set out its agenda for the P5 process and what it wants to achieve there. It was a very active chair last time around in 2018, 2019. And also did a lot for civil society engagement, did a lot for the engagement of younger experts. We can expect more in that regard because that seems to be part of how the UK sees its leadership style now in international nuclear fora, which I think is really great. It's very sort of participatory. It's very aware of the whole ecosystem of nuclear diplomacy, which also includes NGOs and so on. But at the same time, given that we are in a really challenging security environment and that the P5 sometimes have very tense sessions, I wonder what that means for the actual health of the dialogue and for what they are able to cover when they speak behind closed doors and what they're then able to share with everyone. Given that there is a lot of worry about what will happen at the 2026 review conference of the NPT and what the overall health of the treaty is like, it would be fantastic to hear a little more from the P5 and out of the P5 process about how they want to strengthen the process. And that would include states like Russia, which have not been constructive in the NPT recently, and also China, which has been reluctant to engage constructively. It has been constructive on some topics, but it has not necessarily been that open or transparent on other topics. Given that all of these states profess to care about the NPT, it would be great to see them pull together a little more and try to offer something with a view to the review conference and the fact that there are a lot of other states that are also very concerned about the treaty and want to see the treaty strengthen rather than weaken further.
We return to Sebastian Brixey-Williams for his assessment of how the current British government has to balance security challenges with its disarmament diplomacy.
Labour might decide to be more transparent. They've got a difficult job ahead of them. On the one hand, modernisation, potentially feeling like the warhead numbers or the delivery vehicles may not be sufficient at a time of greater crisis, and maybe there is a need to build that out. At the same time, not wanting to be seen as a proliferating country and taking steps to do that, and still trying to continue work on irreversible nuclear disarmament and some of the other disarmament and arms control initiatives that they've been feeding into. I would say the response in the UK, at least, has been one of tight-lippedness, which is a typically British response to a lot of things. I think it's an interesting thing, because if China is indeed at 600 or so warheads at the moment, and the UK and France are perhaps coming up towards 250, 300, the difference there is not as stark as between, say, China and the US. At the moment, even if China progresses to over 1,000, which it's projected to do on the current timelines in the early 2030s, at the same time, if you are in Russia, and possibly in China as well, and you're thinking about what you're deterring, it is not just the US, it is NATO. It's precisely the reason that the UK would talk about being a contributor to NATO and being a second independent decision-making centre. It may be that the UK and the US have slightly different relations with these countries, but the alliance is the same. And so it would make more sense, if you were talking about trying to control arms in some ways, to be thinking about NATO as a whole, not just taking the US out of that in isolation. The flip side to this is there are several other countries that have nuclear weapons, whether they're recognized under the NPT or not, as in the case of India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. They're also hovering around the sort of low hundreds. So what do? Do you start to bring them in as well? And so I think the key obstacle here is, if you wanted to bring the UK and France into this, why not, say, India and Pakistan, which have comparable numbers of weapons as well? And so you get into the kind of conversations about what's sometimes called the strategic chain, where you have Pakistan deterring India, India's deterring China, China's deterring Russia and the US, and maybe NATO as a whole, and the US is deterring China and Russia. Everything is connected, and we have to think in systems ways about these issues. And so for me, the proposal to bring in the UK and France without having some way to bring in those other states as well, it's going to run into problems, I think, pretty early on, because in a sense, they're going to say, why us? And why not them? And a key stumbling point in all of this is China is very unwilling to recognize India as having nuclear weapons. It's a particular issue they have there. And in a sense, they say, we're not willing to talk about this with India because it elevates the Indian status up to one of being a nuclear weapons state, which is a tricky argument because there is a fact on the ground, which is that India does have nuclear weapons. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't speak to them. But this is the argument that China puts out. And so if you're looking at these things in a chain, that's the weak link in the chain that seems to sever India and Pakistan, at least, from those other countries. And then, of course, Israel and North Korea. Israel, which doesn't admit it has nuclear weapons and never has, and North Korea, which is a tricky actor to negotiate with, as we all know. They pose particular issues then, even if you manage to get India and Pakistan into the conversation. This is one of those conversations that's hard to have.
The UK is currently conducting a strategic defence review. Marion Messmer continues to explore how geopolitical shifts and internal debates might shape the future of British nuclear policy.
As part of its minimum deterrent, the UK essentially operates 4 nuclear-armed submarines. They form its sea-based deterrent. The UK went towards an entirely sea-based deterrent and submarine-based deterrent because they saw that as the greatest way of ensuring their second strike capabilities, because submarines have a very high level of survivability in case of a crisis. In the UK calculation, that meant that the UK could go to lower numbers of nuclear weapons and also down to a single delivery system, because that would be a good insurance policy in case of a nuclear war. So at the moment, the UK has 4 Vanguard-class submarines, and all of them are beyond their expected 25-year lifespan. They were all built essentially between the late 80s and early 90s, and they were expected to be able to be in service for about 25 years. I mean, of course, submarines are very expensive investments, and so almost always you expect that you're able to recertify them, reservice them for a few additional years, so it's not that surprising. What is perhaps surprising and potentially a little concerning, given that the UK put such a high premium on having a deterrent that is continuously at sea, is that because there are only these 4 submarines, whenever one of them is out for repairs or needs maintenance, that then means that you have fewer to draw on. And over the last few years, there have been a few times where the submarines either had to extend their patrol time or they had to be out for repairs for longer periods of time, because there were some issues with the submarines. That goes to show that actually the replacement submarines are really needed. So a few years ago, the UK made the decision to replace those 4 submarines, and they are currently developing 4 new submarines. In terms of numbers, it's going to be a like-for-like replacement, but they are developing a new submarine for it, which is going to be a Dreadnought-class submarine. These submarines are meant to enter service in the early 2030s. So potentially as soon as 5 years from now. And as of earlier this year, the UK government still claims that the replacement is going ahead as planned and the construction cycle is on track. But there are some concerns whether that is going to be truly possible, in part because a previous submarine program, a non-nuclear submarine program, the Astute-class submarines, was actually severely delayed. And also all the shipyards were struggling quite a bit during COVID, in part because of COVID and the pandemic and restrictions did to their working schedule, but also because of challenges with supply chains and supply chain delays. And so it's surprising to hear that apparently these shipyards that are always struggling for capacity have been able to catch up on their schedule in terms of constructing these submarines. But one can only hope that is the case because, as I mentioned, given that the older submarines will really need to be replaced at some point, and the UK obviously doesn't want there to be a gap in continuity between having access to the old submarines and the new submarines, it is quite important that delivery schedule works out. The other thing I would point out at this stage, which is not so much to do with the submarines, perhaps, or at least not with the submarine replacement program, but with the Trident missiles that the UK uses to deliver its nuclear weapons, is that there have been a few failed missile tests recently and some mixed messaging around it. The UK actually doesn't test these missiles all that often independently. It usually relies on and points to US tests because the Trident missile is a US missile that the UK purchases from the US. But when the UK did try to independently test that missile a short while ago, the missile test didn't work out in the way that it would have been expected, and the missile crashed into the sea, essentially without being able to complete its flight path. And the messaging around that has been a little surprising to me because there was essentially a lot of pointing to US missile tests, which are successful. But at the same time, for me, the question remains what it is exactly about the UK missile tests that mean that subsequent tests have failed. Because if it really was just a one-off, then you would expect to be able to fix it for the next missile test. But it seems to be that whenever the UK tries to test their missiles, there's a challenge with it. Of course, all the real data from the test is classified, so it's very difficult to figure out what exactly is going on. And we only really have the reassurance messages of the Ministry of Defence to go on. But if we're talking about the reliability of the UK's nuclear capabilities and what that would mean in case of a real emergency, for me, that raises some questions that are probably quite uncomfortable for the Ministry of Defence and UK government around how healthy the UK submarines and the UK missiles really are. I have wondered whether they might want to do another test. I think if they were confident that another test would work out, it would actually be a good show of that confidence to conduct a successful test. But the tests are also very expensive themselves, which I think might be why the UK is testing so rarely. I presume that they haven't necessarily got another test planned immediately, probably not until at least the current security and defence review that the new Labour government is currently conducting is concluded. But it's a great question, given that the last tests resulted in so much discussion and so much questions around the feasibility of conducting a test. The submarines are already accounted for in the defence budget, also in the defence budget going forward. If you look at the UK defence spending, for a long time the UK was at the head of the league table among NATO member states in terms of how much they spend per GDP. But as more NATO member states are investing more in their conventional capabilities, the UK only increased its defence spending slightly, and is now roughly in the middle of the league table of all NATO member states. In large part, that has always been due to the UK maintaining nuclear capabilities, which take up a huge chunk of the UK defence budget. If you only look at UK conventional spending, then actually the UK's defence expenditure looks much more modest in comparison to other NATO member states. So it definitely does take a lot of funds. But the UK is committed to maintaining that. So I don't think that they will run out of money to build these submarines, but I think it could potentially put other elements of the defence budget under further strain, and they would probably rather cut elsewhere before they cut in the nuclear area. At the moment, after the new UK government came in this past autumn, they announced that they wanted to conduct a strategic defence review. The UK has been through a lot of reviews over the last few years. There was the integrated review in 2021, which announced the change in the UK warhead cap and essentially increased the UK warhead cap. At the same time, because that strategic defence review was announced just before the COVID pandemic and then published in 2021, there was a lot that then changed over the next few years. Only roughly a year after the integrated review was published, the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place. And so in 2023, the UK government conducted another review, which was just a small review. It was called the Integrated Review Refresh, to essentially account for the fact that there had been a review that had just taken place, but that government felt that in light of the really big change in the security environment in Europe, it was important to acknowledge that and to reflect on that. The Integrated Review Refresh didn't have any big news on the nuclear front. They didn't change anything further about the warhead cap or anything like that, but they did adjust some of the language about where the UK saw threats coming from. So in the Integrated Review, a lot of the language about threats looked to the Pacific, it looked to the changing role of China, and it also expressed the UK's ambition to be more present in the Pacific and to be a partner to the US in that regard. But in the refresh, there was this acknowledgement that the security environment in Europe had changed to an extent that the UK did not feel able to exclusively focus on the Pacific in the way that it might have previously done. So there was this refocusing on Europe, which also makes a lot of sense for the UK's role and for the UK's traditional role in European security. The UK also announced after Brexit that it wanted to remain a strong partner in NATO and that it would essentially focus a lot of its contributions to European security through NATO. All of that, in terms of strategic alignment, makes a lot of sense. And we are now looking at the Strategic Defence Review, which is expected to be published in spring 2025 at some point. It will be really interesting to see how the current government sees the security environment, what has changed from their perspective. I would expect to see a continuation of this focus on Europe. The government also said at the outset that it wouldn't want to change anything about the importance of the UK's nuclear weapons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they might not announce any further changes, whether it's to the warhead ceiling or whether it's through something else. In other words, beyond saying that they were definitely maintaining nuclear weapons, they didn't say very much. So it'll be interesting to see how their thinking might change and what that might mean for the UK's nuclear posture going forward. It will also be really interesting whether the government sets out any of its thinking about future arms control or future regulation. The previous government was very active when it came to AI regulation, which is obviously also increasingly of military concern. And the UK for many years has been a really strong state in the non-proliferation treaty regime and has invested a lot in increasing understanding of verification, working closely with Norway.
To close today's conversation, Sebastian Brixey-Williams highlights an unusual feature of the British nuclear weapons program.
Much like in the United States, sole authority for launch now sits with the Prime Minister. They would have the ability to essentially call it in, transmit the order. The British nuclear weapons are said to be at several days' notice to fire. The targeting data is not uploaded to the missiles. Unlike the United States, they are not on high alert all the time. They would have to be readied for launch, and that would ultimately end up with the submarine coming to the surface and launching the weapons. If the Prime Minister was incapacitated for whatever reason, they have a delegated sort of second in command. That seems to change depending on the government. There was some conversation during the Boris Johnson premiership when he had COVID-19 as to whether he had delegated that authority to Dominic Raab, who was in his cabinet, although I'm not sure if that was ever confirmed in the public sphere. And then the other kind of exception to all of this is what are called the letters of last resort in the UK system. On the first day of office, the UK Prime Minister sits down and receives a briefing from, I think it's the Cabinet Secretary, that they need to write a letter. And the letter needs to instruct the Royal Navy on what to do if London is destroyed, the Prime Minister is presumed dead, and there's an inability to receive orders from London as to how to respond. And not a huge amount is known about these letters. Essentially, they are a letter that is put inside an envelope. They're never read by anybody except the Prime Minister, and then they go inside a safe in the Vanguard submarine. It is only in sort of extreme circumstances where a series of tests on board the submarine have been performed, which supposedly includes checking whether BBC Radio 4 is broadcasting the Today programme over the course of several weeks, just to make sure that the commanding officer and the executive officer can make the decision as to whether they open the safes and read that letter. The letter then contains the order that they are supposed to follow. And so then at that point, it's in the hands of the commander to decide what they're going to do. It's a fascinating quirk of the British system. America doesn't have anything equivalent to this, nor does France, nor, as far as we know, do any of the other countries with nuclear weapons. It poses some really interesting legal questions, as to whether a prime minister writing a letter, let's say 3 or 4 years earlier, could write an order that could possibly be compliant with international law, given that actually they don't know what circumstances that letter is going to be read in. Accordingly, does it create a kind of accountability gap where Prime Minister is presumed dead and the commanding officer is following superior orders, but has to perform this order, which actually they have no way to check the context of? But it's really held a grip in the public imagination in the UK.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.